I've learnt so much as a line manager, which I'm going to take back to the workplace myself.
The information was amazing. So many people resonated, and there was actually a lot of functional information.
My favourite thing was the talks from Colin. I think he got the information across really accessibly, but also in a way that I felt was sympathetic to people with ADHD.
Loved hearing about the different lived experiences from Tom and from Demet. Both brought a completely different viewpoint across, so really fascinating to hear.
I wholeheartedly recommend it. 11 out of 10 or 100 out of 10.
I think they give you really practical takeaways and an opportunity to network with other people in this field in a safe environment.
This was really well thought through, brilliant speakers. People really need to check this stuff out.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to another skill session online. Yeah, welcome. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Say hi in the chat. You can see it's all heating up already, so that's fantastic. So yeah, welcome to another skill sessions event. This is an event series, both online and in person, hosted by CareScribe. It's designed to share knowledge about areas of neurodiversity and disability and help to build and foster an inclusive community for these sorts of topics to be discussed. Each event is based on a different topic, and we're very excited today to have Helen Eaton talking to us about autism and neurodiversity, and that is her sort of specialism. So lovely to see so many of you here. As I say, get active on the chat. Let us know where you're kind of joining from, what the weather's like, all that sort of stuff. I'm imagining wet and windy, but yeah, let's see. Also, just to mention, change your Zoom chat settings to all so everybody can see. Otherwise, you're just messaging us as participants. As panelists. So yeah, make sure you change your Zoom chat settings. And yeah, we encourage everybody to keep posting and messaging and talking throughout today's session, because yeah, that's what these skill sessions are all about. Great. So yeah, just while we're all joining, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes, tell you a little bit about CareScribe, and then I'll hand over to Helen. So as I mentioned, Skill Sessions is run by CareScribe, and who are we? So my name's Rich. I'm one of the founders and directors of CareScribe. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, we are a assistive technology business based out of Bristol. Myself and the other two founders, Chris and Tom, we're all neurodivergent, as are many of our team. And as a company, we spend every day working to support disabled and neurodivergent individuals, essentially to study and work more independently. And we do that by building technology. Our software tools, which you may have heard of before, are Captioned and TalkType. What are they, I hear you ask? So let me tell you a little bit about them. So Captioned is a captioning and note-taking software designed to help people to better comprehend and retain some of the huge amounts of information that are thrown at us in our busy lives. This is, of course, of tremendous value to those with a wide range of disabilities and neurodivergent profiles, from those maybe who are deaf or have hearing loss, who may have difficulty comprehending exactly what's being said, to those like me who are dyslexic, have ADHD, ASD, who may have similar difficulties or find it hard to retain information and focus on information. Even those who maybe have motor impairments, who find it hard to get information down quickly in a timely manner. So that's Captioned, all about captioning and comprehending and retaining information. And then we've got TalkType, which is a piece of dictation software, which is essentially designed to help people convert thoughts to text, something that a wide range of people find very difficult for a wide range of people, wide range of reasons, myself included. If you want to know anything about any of our software or our company, then feel free to pop something in the chat, and we'll get back to you, or you can find more information on the website at carescribe.io. Other things just to mention, again, we've still got people joining, lots and lots of people joining, which is fantastic. It's just a small bit of housekeeping. So You may well be familiar with Zoom by now, but if you're not, captions are available through Zoom, so you can turn those on at your leisure. Questions, keep the chat going. If you've got specific questions for myself or Helen, then please pop them in the Q&A section. It's a slightly separate section to the chat that you should find in the bottom menu. But if you pop them in the Q&A section, we'll have some dedicated time at the end to answer them. If you spot questions that other people have written and you want to you want to ask them as well, then upvote those questions and we'll try and prioritize them when we go through them at the end. There are no wrong questions. This is a safe place, so please ask any questions you might have. You'll be glad to know this session is recorded, so look out for an email from CareScribe with the recording, and it'll also be on LinkedIn tomorrow. We will also email out Helen's slide deck along with the recording and any resources following the webinar. So all of that will be coming to you. So look out for that. And the only other thing to mention is that we run these sessions every single month, and we have fantastic speakers like Helen. We've already got our kind of next session, our May session lined up, and we've got Danielle Kudjo-Makalski, who's joining us, who's the founder of Thinking Light Coach, and she's a certified coach, consultant, and TEDx speaker. She's going to be joining us and talking about how she's sort of navigated her neurodiversity in a corporate space. Great. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Helen. So Helen is an autism and neurodiversity specialist with over 20 years of experience in designing and delivering leadership and communication skills training. Helen combines her lived experience with her understanding of neurodivergent strengths and challenges and relevant case studies. And she's going to talk to us about all of this today under the bracket of kind of reasonable adjustments. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. This is always my favourite thing to talk about. So I am, as Rich said, Helen Eaton, and I've got quite a lot of experience in this area. When I deliver these talks, these training sessions, I always sort of want to justify why I get to talk about this, really. So if I briefly say, actually, it's gone up to 25 years plus. I was counting today, thinking about my age and realising, yep, it's 25 years worth of experience now. Fantastic. Something to celebrate, maybe. But lots of experience working in the arena of neurodiversity in particular. That's just some of the work I've done. But maybe the most important things to say are that this is about lived experience. My whole household, my family of 5, we're all neurodivergent, different kind of stuff going on with all of us, which makes it an interesting house, to say the least, lively and fun, and some challenges along the way. And my free time is spent working alongside and with and supporting neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people. So from little ones in early years through to teenagers through to adults. So I kind of live and breathe this stuff. You know, my world is neurodiversity and the neurodivergent people. In terms of today's session, we're going to look a little bit about the language around neurodiversity and reasonable adjustments, just to kind of set a frame for us all. I'll briefly summarise neurodiversity, and there's some kind of disclaimers to that. We just have a short amount of time relative to the subject together, but I'll kind of get us all to a level point if I can. Absolutely, we'll focus on the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments and a couple of case studies to make this relevant as well. In terms of questions, that you will try and get some time at the end to answer those questions. There may be lots and lots, which is good, because I really want to get you thinking. And this is the sort of a starting point, you know, or a sort of a refresher for some of you in terms of understanding neurodiversity and the neurodivergent and reasonable adjustments and the duty around reasonable adjustments. I hope you go away and start thinking, wow, what can I do differently? And as you go through the session, if you have a thought about, I can see a change I can make here, please do share that in the chat. Always appreciated. So neurodiversity, it is a movement. It's a recognition of diverse minds in the world. I always say neurodivergent people are absolutely everywhere and have been so forever. It's just really now that we're kind of recognizing these differences. We have sort of medical labels, as it were, for them, and a greater understanding of the diverse mix of minds that we're kind of working and living with. So we have neurodivergent minds, neurodivergent people. So those minds have diverged perhaps from a typical or majority developmental path, and the neurotypical. I'm not going to use the word normal here at all. That's not relevant anywhere. But that notion of neurotypical, so typical neurological development. And the term neurodivergent groups together people with different conditions, and I talk about 6 main conditions today, and these impact how an individual processes and experiences the world around them. There are lots of things that make us different from each other. In terms of neurodiversity, we have a sort of a majority collection of people whose brains are kind of processing and ticking along in different ways, but we can see commonalities between those thinking, those ways of thinking and those ways of processing, which kind of helps us to group them together. And neurodivergent people are in absolutely every workplace, really. If you've got more than a couple of people in your team, yeah, there's a good chance there'll be neurodivergent people amongst you. And something to remember is it's common to have more than one diagnosis as well. That was slowly kind of realizing this, there's the commonalities between these conditions and the overlap and the kind of having 2 or 3 things at the same time. I'm going to talk about the language. I think that's really helpful. So the social language we use, the great terms we might use versus maybe the medical language. And I'm running with the medical language more today, and I'll explain that in a moment. So you might hear terms neurospicy. I love that. We're a neurospicy house. Even the word neurodivergent, that's not a medical diagnosis. It's not a medical term. It's a kind of movement that's built pace. And kind of, you know, gathered ideas and thoughts as it's growing, as it's rolling along. Came across neuroshiny the other day, loved that. The Zoom is that perhaps somebody who has ADHD and has kind of a real surge of energy. The notion of having superpowers that people might talk about how they might frame being neurodivergent. Dopamining, that sort of behavior where somebody's looking for dopamine kind of reward hormones, enjoying what they're doing. Those are all words that people own and bounce around. But none of those words are used in tribunals, on medical records, for Department of Work and Pension or access to work. So in terms of framing the language, today I'm going more with the medical terminology. These terms are great, but they're not going to be used in any official capacity. So apologies to anybody who has a preference for the language used. So for clarity, I'll run with the medical language rather than wonderful words like neurospicy. So the words I'll run with today, I'll talk about autism. So a person we generally say is autistic. Autistic people generally say they are autistic. The word suffer from autism or suffer from ADHD is language I will, sort of shove terms like that well to one side. And we often say a person is autistic. As somebody said to me once, it's not like a handbag. I don't have autism. I don't pick it up and put it back down again. I am autistic. But the conditions, I'll use the medical terminology: autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. I'll probably call those the 4 Ds. A lot easier to say than what I've just said. So that's what we're focusing on today, and understanding what's going on there very loosely, very lightly, but also looking at why we need to make reasonable adjustments from the people support side, the people side, the empathy side, the understanding side, but also the legal duty to support people who are autistic or dyslexic and need adjustments in the workplace. What I'm not doing today is I'm not fully explaining the conditions. I'm not describing the lived experience. I'm not showing or highlighting the power of neurodivergent thinking. That's something I really do believe in, but I'm not demonstrating that today. I'm not describing the full range of common co-occurring conditions and intersectionality, and I'm not highlighting potential impact on mental health. Those are hugely important topics that need to be done. Justice needs to be done to those in longer, larger sessions than we have today. So I'm fully aware of all this stuff, but we're not covering it today. Lots of other stuff really important we are doing. This stuff, come back to me, come back to other trainers and spend more time focused on this stuff, because all of those things are important, just not fitting in today. So why do we need to know about neurodiversity? Pop your thoughts in chat, actually. I'll give you a moment to think about that. So I said neurodivergent people have been around for a long time. the diagnosis, the language around diagnosis has been increasing. Access to diagnosis has been increasing to some degree. It's kind of getting a bit more restrictive now, accessing diagnosis through the NHS for lots of complex reasons. But the words neurodiversity, it's bouncing around. Brilliant for me. I've been shouting about this stuff for quite a while. Pop in chat, what are your thoughts about why are you interested in neurodiversity? Why is it important to you? And I've just seen the lovely phrase neurosparkly in chat. That's awesome. Yeah, neurosparkly. Yeah, that one repeated there. When I ask organisations and charities about why we need to know more about neurodiversity, the common messages are, well, we're getting a greater understanding. People are more aware as individuals about their needs, about their differences, about their strengths and their challenges. And as employers, organisations, support organisations, we need to know more to better support them and better understand them. And it's stuff that just hasn't been spoken about enough. Yeah, and as I've spotted in chat, there just isn't a place where there isn't neurodiversity. Absolutely right. And it's probably key to note as well that in the past, the outcomes for neurodivergent people weren't always particularly positive. Late understanding, late diagnosis, late to get support. You know, and there's lots of reasons why people just weren't talking about this. It was having a huge impact. And if I say estimated, it's sometimes quite hard to count all the neurodivergent people out there because we don't all wear badges and put our hands up and say, hey, that's me. So it's quite hard to count, but it's estimated about 1 in 14 people are neurodivergent. So when I go into schools, and children in schools go on to become employees in your organisations further down the road, there's a couple of kids in every classroom who may be autistic or dyslexic or dyspraxic or have ADHD. You know, I can see that in our classrooms, and that those people go on to join workforces in the future. So as I say, there's a lot of neurodivergent people out there. And somebody in chat has made a great point about as we realise as adults that we may be neurodivergent, we need to you know, generate that understanding around us as well, so people understand what's going on and we understand why we are and who we are and all the stuff that's going on. You will work with colleagues and clients who are diagnosed, self-diagnosed. There's lots around that concept, but obviously adults self-diagnose before they go on to get a formal diagnosis. So somebody can see throughout their life, they can recognise these traits, these challenges, these differences, these strengths, and they've been consistent throughout their life. That's when self-diagnosis become valid. It's a bit of a grey area under law. Sometimes it's considered perhaps a working diagnosis if somebody is waiting to seek an NHS, a formal diagnosis. But self-diagnosis can be valid, but is a little bit of a grey area under law. And there are many people who are completely unaware because they have been who they are for all their lives and done things the way they've done things and not considered that there's something different going on with their processing in terms of how they're kind of processing the world and interacting with the world. You will have people who disclose their diagnosis, and there's some people who will not disclose, and it is their choice, their right to disclose or not to disclose. You may well have neurodivergent people who are feeling really unsupported now, or isolated or misunderstood in the workplace. They might be struggling to communicate in the way other people expect them to. They may well have no adjustments, no allowances, which would enable them to access what everyone else is accessing. And report statistics say there's a high chance of feeling bullied in the workplace as well. So we're looking at reasonable adjustments. We're looking at the Equality Act. We're looking at neurodiversity. And these are the reasons that we're talking about this, because you will have colleagues and clients who are neurodivergent and experiencing the difficulties I've listed there. There is a duty to support people. If I look at what makes us neurodivergent, then let's kind of get a bit of an understanding around that. We all have many layers that make us us. So childhood experiences, health, trauma, the kind of all the sort of socioeconomic factors, the demographics, all that stuff that makes us us. We all have a brain at the core of what we're doing. That one I can guarantee. We all have a brain at the core of what we're doing that's driving all of this stuff. That's the command center, really. If you're neurodivergent, there are processing differences within your brain, and we can see those processing differences, often the challenges that people might have in terms of what other people can do readily and easily, or the different way that people do things, the different way that memory is stored, or things are processed, or things are communicated. There are processing differences within the brain that make us neurodivergent. I'm not going to go any deeper into the science than that, thankfully. And it's kind of neurodivergent sort of differencing, the neurodivergent processing. All of those conditions are about how memory, so memory around numbers, memory around spelling and words, memory about long-term memory, short-term memory, how information is processed, and how executive functioning works. All of those are different and distinct within neurodivergent minds. So executive functioning, if you've not heard of that phrase, actually think of like a PA, a personal assistant, or an admin role within your brain. The executive functioning bit of your brain keeps you organised, on track, sees a whole list of things you need to do and gets them done in the right order. Neurodivergent brains often have differences around executive functioning. And as I talk a little bit about more autism and ADHD, those will come to light a little bit more. If you're neurodivergent and there are processing differences, there's a connectivity difference in your brain as well, and what that comes out at. So in the workplace, where we might see differences in learning preferences, how people want to learn and retain and access information, the responses people might make to different situations, the social needs that a person has, sometimes emotional regulation. So emotions can be quite contained. Emotions might bounce around a bit more freely than other people, and how a person might communicate. So these are 6 distinct conditions. Autism, ADHD, and the 4Ds. They are 6 distinct conditions. The overlap is it's all about memory, information processing, executive functioning, and there are connectivity differences between different parts of the brain as well. So in terms of the reasonable adjustments, why we need to make reasonable adjustments is if we keep doing things the way we've all done things, which can be very sort of a limited approach, very fixed thinking, then we're putting barriers in place for those who will maybe learn differently, have different communication needs, or may respond differently, who might deal and process information differently. That's why we need reasonable adjustments in place at the core of neurodivergent people, these processing differences that filter out into how they behave, how they learn, how they kind of communicate and connect and interact. And we need to make adjustments, because as organisations, if we could keep doing things the way we've done it, these barriers are stopping people joining our organisations, but also retaining staff, allowing staff to develop, to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to get promoted, or to keep doing what they always want to do day in, day out, things they're good at. So if we don't make these reasonable adjustments, if we don't consider neurodivergent processing differences in the workplace, we're putting lots of blockers and barriers in place for people that really shouldn't be there. And the law says they shouldn't be there too. So as I said, those are the diagnoses we're talking about today: autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. I'll go over each in a little bit of detail. And remember, late diagnosis is common. So you would kind of think, gosh, surely if you're dyslexic, you would know. Somebody would spot it, you'd get a diagnosis. I come across so many young people entering further education, higher education, the diagnosis only just pops out then, or they get into the workplace and somebody picks up perhaps some difficulties they have, some challenges or meeting certain expectations around language and writing and emails and messages, and maybe let's screen you for dyslexia. Lots of reasons why our education system isn't picking people up early enough, or getting diagnoses quickly enough, or putting support in place. But it is common to have late diagnosis, even people kind of coming through our education system now, or people who are like me, a little bit older, and there just wasn't access to this stuff. And interesting to know, I said these conditions, you can have a couple of things. You could have autism and ADHD, that's proving more and more common. You could have dyslexia and ADHD, but the diagnosis pathways are separate. So you might have a colleague who's going for a diagnosis of autism and actually has to go down another route, start all over again if they think they might have ADHD or dyslexia. You know, it's not easy. So in the workplace, we also need that understanding, actually, in terms of reasonable adjustments and deciding, are we going to wait until there's a formal diagnosis, or will we accept a working diagnosis knowing that person is seeking a referral, perhaps for autism or ADHD? Let's touch on these conditions very briefly. It's good that you can come back to this and have a look at this. I don't want to not do justice to these conditions. So you will see now, warning, high level overview. I actually wanted hazard light flashing here, whoa, whoa, and kind of sirens going. Very high level overview. But dyslexia, we're talking about a person whose brain doesn't process language, sounds, spelling, reading, writing in typical ways. And that comes out in not reading things quickly or misfinding words, very poor spelling or grammar, loads of ways that might come out, but it's about kind of decoding language in the brain. That bit of the brain just doesn't connect in the same way. Dysgraphia, less diagnosed, but fairly common. And it is just it is a difficulty getting what's in your head onto paper. So all the stuff that's going in your head, really tricky to get that stuff on paper. Dysgraphia impacts writing in particular. Dyscalculia, consistent difficulties around maths. So skills, math skills, time, money, measurements, calculations. Right from the start, early years, all the way through, this stuff doesn't disappear. And dyspraxia means that the brain doesn't quite send the movement, the coordination signals consistently and effectively to the bits of the body all the time. So that person might seem awkward and clumsy. It always seems fair to say, look, there are real strengths, real power to having these different processing. And we often see with anyone with the 4Ds, they're very visual thinkers, can be really creative and absolutely have an alternative working style because they're not accessing things in the same way that other people are. They're not dealing with numbers in a typical way if you dyscalculate. In terms of autistic preferences, again, that high level alert. If we're looking at this of the perspective, so our lens today is reasonable adjustments. Our lens is looking at the Equality Act and the need to offer support. Autism is complex, is fascinating and interesting, and I'd love to do it justice, but this is a really high level overview. What we commonly see with autistic preferences is a need for routine that gives safety and security. Consistency is really helpful. There is an ability to hyper focus and get locked into something, to be an absolute specialist, but to really get locked into what's happening. And there are often different communication needs and different social needs. And there can be a sense of fixed thoughts or some inflexibility, what might be called rigid thinking on some subjects. But goodness me, our autistic people are clear, concise, relevant, logical, completers, accurate, focused, committed, experts and specialists. And if you detect any sense of bias, you're probably correct. And that is right and true from my perspective here. But those are some of the reasons. So if we're thinking about reasonable adjustments and how we might support people, these are some of the areas that we could support autistic people. You know, they will benefit from low sensory spaces and reduced overwhelm in order to manage some of these preferences, some of these differences. And we often have to think as well, socializing does take more social energy and does take a little bit more active thinking for autistic people. Autism is more complex than that, but with that lens of reasonable adjustments, I think this information is useful today. But there is so much more going on that's fascinating and brilliant. And in terms of ADHD, again, warning, high level overview. You'll get tired of hearing that, I think, but it's important. And somebody with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, not a term that lots of ADHD people might like because it's about disorder and it always sounds as though you're not enough or you haven't got enough or you're flawed or you there's a deficit here. That's the medical language we're running with today, though. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There might be challenges, struggles, some differences around time management, self-management, just remembering to, you know, take a drink of water when you're really busy, stuff like that. Definitely fluctuating energy levels, so loads of energy and enthusiasm. That might drop off when they burn out a little bit. Probably feel restless and impatient with things that aren't as exciting, so might struggle to maintain focus on boring tasks. And a degree depending on the individual, of impulsiveness or risk-taking. And that may, for some of us, look like if there's a sign that says do not touch or do not enter. Some of us, mentioning no names, may not be able to resist signs like that. That slightly impulsive behaviour, that was, oh, I wonder if I just, through to people who might partake in really risky activities and really risky sports and interests and stuff, and maybe life choices. It's a sliding scale. Yeah, some of us just can't resist, you know, pushing the button that we shouldn't push, and others, yeah, it's a scale. But our ADHD people, wow, energy, enthusiasm, motivated, committed, positive, you know, loads of ideas, creative, engaged. They can be really chatty, they can be really fun, it can be really lively. ADHD, sometimes that's all in the head. For some people with ADHD, it comes out in physical movement. For some people with ADHD, all those thoughts are bouncing around, not necessarily coming out in physical movement. Again, there is so much more to being ADHD, but through our lens of reasonable adjustments, I think this is a kind of a good frame to put it in. And it is a difference in how the brain controls rewards and attention. And also those processing differences are there about memory and executive functioning and how information is processed. But there's a difference in how the brain is managing attention and rewards. And that's often linked to the hormone dopamine, but we don't need any more on that. Our ADHD people absolutely can hyper focus for long periods of time and really get lost in passions and interests and have a really enthusiasm for stuff. So again, thinking through the lens of reasonable adjustments, keep in mind what we're talking about at high level, what we're talking about in terms of being neurodivergent and how that might affect people in positive ways and also as challenges. And this often gets overlooked. And looking through the lens of reasonable adjustments, I'm just about to come on to those now. Most, if not all, neurodivergent, particularly autistic people, particularly people with ADHD, have sensory challenges. Now, a neurodivergent sensory system, systems, these don't effectively process sensory inputs. You might be under or oversensitive to a massive range of things, or have poor fault filtering or integration of senses. And sensory distress, when your sensory system isn't coping with all the inputs, so the sights, the sounds, the smells, the movements, the tastes, the internal feelings of pain and hunger, all that stuff that our brain processes, that's amazing. Neurodivergent brains don't process sensory information as effectively, or can be hypersensitive and really detect certain inputs really strongly. So really strong, particular smells or tastes, have a really strong reaction to that, or no reaction sometimes. But sensory distress can push people into fight, flies, or freeze mode. They can cause a real sense of overwhelm. Sensory system keeps you safe. If it gets overwhelmed and overloaded, it will push you into fight, flight, or freeze mode, into a distressed state. This is important because some of the people that come to you may say, look, there's a sensory input, or they might talk about lights or heating or noise that's causing a huge amount of stress. So I'd really like to remember that for neurodivergent people, the sensory system, the sensory processing system doesn't work in the same way. It was effectively was a lot more hyperactive, hypersensitive than a typical person's. So really listen to those requests, because you might think, gosh, what's wrong with you? Why can't you sit by the open door? What's the problem? The aircon noise doesn't bother me, or I don't mind if somebody's cooking in the kitchen. You might think that, but for a neurodivergent person, actually the sensory distress in a day can be the thing that stops them from coming into the office. So I can have a quick look to see if there's any desperate questions that have kind of popped up that or anything to add now. Okay, there's lots of stuff around the content in general, which is good. So let's look at the legal side then. 6 conditions are generally considered to be disabilities and therefore protected characteristics under the Equality Act. Once the diagnosis comes, pretty much that's guaranteed. A little bit of a grey area sometimes around dyscalculia or dyspraxia. It has to be how much these things, and all the 4 Ds, how much these things impact a person day to day, and their ability to function or to do what everyone else is doing, or to access what everyone else is doing. And if you can prove they significantly impact these things, then they are considered as protected characteristics as disabilities under the Equality Act. So I will read this out because I think this is important. You can not listen. You can read it yourself if you want to, or you can listen to me. So not all neurodivergent workers will consider themselves to be disabled. Workers have the right to identify or not identify with the term as they see fit. Under the Equality Act 2010, neurodivergent workers are, however, likely to meet the legal definition of disability. This provides them with important rights of reasonable adjustments and protections against discrimination, harassment and victimisation. Workers are also protected against discrimination by association. This may arise when a worker is treated less favourably because they have a dependent with a neurodivergent condition, e.g. parents or carers of perhaps an autistic child or dyspraxic child. And that was current at the time I pulled it from the GMB Union website. I think the wording of this is important to get it right. So it was current when I copied it across. And when we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, again, I think it's important to get the language right. So it's a change that must be made to remove a disadvantage related to an employee's disability when doing the job and a job applicant's disability when applying for a job. A reasonable adjustment could involve making changes to the workplace and working arrangements, equipment, support or services provided, the way things are done, and providing information in an accessible format. Lots to think about there, lots to start thinking about, well, actually, what do I need to consider? What do I need to be doing in the workplace? An employer could be liable under law if they do not do these things. For example, if someone does not get the reasonable adjustments they need at work, they could make a disability discrimination claim to an employment tribunal. So those cases are on the rise. So case law is developing there. There'll be new situations, new examples that are occurring all the time. So we can look back over past case law and see what's happened. But, you know, don't be the one to set the precedent where your organisation may have got it wrong. You don't want to be future case law, do you, for future examples. So it's an evolving area and a developing area, but there's some great advice out there from legal firms, ensuring you're getting it right. If in doubt, double check. A couple of real case studies then. That might help you think a little bit more about this. So real stories. So Kay's employed as a general restaurant assistant and he disclosed his dyslexia when applying. He's also autistic, but he didn't want to share that. His choice. And on his first day, he'd said he would struggle to write down orders quickly and legibly on a notepad, and actually felt a little bit nervous about talking to customers at the tables and taking those orders from them, particularly if they were going to make anything complicated or change what they wanted. So his role was adjusted on the first day to focus on table clearing and managing stock. And after a few months, he would offer the chance to learn how to use the till. And that took a little bit more time to develop his confidence, but he now happily takes orders at the tills. And actually, I've had an update recently. He's now also starting to kind of help cook and prepare food, which is fantastic. That was all done really discreetly, no fuss, no bother, I think is the easiest way to say it. Just simple adjustments made on the day. He didn't ask for anything in advance, but when he got those, said, this doesn't feel good. I don't think I can do this, but I can do the other stuff. Does it mean that more team members are writing down orders on notepads than him? Yes, it does. Does it mean he's doing more time on till, clearing tables, wash up than them? Yes, it does, but it's a whole team approach, and those adjustments are fair to him. And I don't know whether actually his difficulties or differences have been disclosed at all to anybody else. Those adjustments were just made and put in discreetly. And R is a trainee solicitor, and going through the interview process, I believe, is quite torturous in terms of law and getting roles and training, etc. And an interview declares her diagnosis. And when asked in an interview, you know, what support she might need, she generally talks about a quiet, and that is genuinely quiet, not a space people come in and out of, but a quiet space to work occasionally or home working some days if this isn't possible. Another option is, you know, is it okay if she wears ear defenders in the office, just to screen some of those sounds, and actually have a high screen around her desk, creating a calm space or a tidy space for her, and it's a little bit quieter. So those are the adjustments that she would ask for at interview stage. Now, E has ADHD and can really hyper-focus, fantastic at really getting into work and working at speed on some project tasks. And there's quite a few of the team doing similar things. What E tries to do is get away from the desk, take short breaks to hyper-focus. So the rest of the team will see them getting up, moving away. So they'll go outside, get a drink, walk up and down the stairs, etc. Not distracting others, but kind of getting away just to resettle or rethink. And then measured on outcomes, not hours. And sometimes they really hyper-focus for a couple of days, you know, getting support to make sure they don't burn themselves out. But actually, they might come in later or have a day, you know, home-based when it isn't normally, just time to recover. So there's real flexibility in the moment there for E. Say, yeah, you're working, you get lots done, perhaps in a short amount of time, but you do need those breaks. ADHD brains need often multiple things to focus on to kind of keep things ticking over comfortably in there. And I think it's really important you know, we all listen to these neurodivergent voices. This message was given to me by a student. So I got in touch with some students recently because I'm working with them more universities now, which is fascinating, looking at the student experience, bearing in mind that students will then go into the workplace and need these reasonable adjustments. Anyway, what they said to me was so autism, it is not called an invisible disability for no reason. I've probably striven harder than most to get there, and I'm probably working to a much higher stress level all the time. This speaks to my commitment. Please recognise that and see my potential. Don't see my stereotypes. Ask me how you can best support me to do my best. I always feel like a nuisance, an outsider, and less than others. And a little empathy goes a very long way. And that really resonated with me on a personal note. In the workplace, when I was in a typical job working as an employer full time, I always felt I was apologising for who I was and how I did things. I always felt I was hiding any challenges or any real strengths that I had. I didn't really understand what was going on at the time, but I just felt I was never quite working to my potential. There was so much more I could do, but I wasn't able to express or perhaps demonstrate that in the way that my employer needed or wanted at the time. So this really resonated with me. And certainly the stress levels, being unsupported, being misunderstood, people not having empathy or making changes where needed, for me led to exhaustion. It led to countless stress migraines. It led to just being overwhelmed and not able to do anything else other than work. And as much as I'm sure we all love work, it's nice to do stuff outside of work that isn't work. Now I have the understanding of who I am and I can ask for those adjustments if I need them. I really work to my strengths, and those stress migraines are long gone, which is a relief. So I'm not saying everyone needs to be like me and a freelancer and out there doing their own thing, but it is about understanding the differences, the difficulties, the strengths a person might have, and just helping shape the workplace to help support them. And in terms of reasonable adjustments, if we think of it, do you know what, when I'm talking about this stuff today, you're thinking about new policies, new way of doing things, sometimes we can change things in the workplace that actually really improve it for everyone. You know, I've worked a lot with schools and they say, gosh, if we did that for every pupil, it'd probably make the day a lot better. And sometimes there are changes that can be made for everyone. You know, particularly when we think about recruitment and selection, that's still quite archaic from the process we have there. And then there are genuine, reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustment where a person has said, this is a barrier, this is where I'm finding this very difficult. This adjustment would really help me to succeed or do what everyone else is doing. That is the reasonable adjustment related to protected characteristic of disability under the Equality Act 2010. And then there are kind of day-to-day accommodations we can make. And if we think about that, so the policy and process improvements, review and change how things are done. Reasonable adjustments, actually the law said it should be preemptive. If you know you have somebody who's dyslexic joining, ask them what is their typical way of working or what adjustments may help them. Now you may not get it all right in place exactly the first time, but it's important to ask. And you must respond to requests. If somebody requests a reasonable adjustment, you must respond to that because it's under the framework of the Equality Act 2010, even if they don't realise that themselves. So it must be acknowledged. And if a reasonable adjustment is put in place, it should be across the board. So if somebody requires perhaps some assistive tech, you know, on their laptop or on their devices, then it's really important that is everywhere. That's accessible everywhere, not just in one room or one place. It's got to be consistent, a consistent way of working. And I say these have got to be defendable decisions. If you or your organisation is brought before a tribunal and you are asked, why did you say no to that reasonable adjustment? You must be able to defend that. Some requests may be unreasonable, just not doable, just so expensive it's not feasible, or just not possible within the role itself. That's small. The majority of adjustments should be reasonable and easily implemented, and not overly costly. So a lot of them, there is no cost to making reasonable adjustments. Sometimes there is cost, but think about it in terms of somebody looks you in the eye and say, why did you say no to that? You have to have a good reason and share the reason. If you are saying no to requests, somebody be very clear about why you're saying no to that reasonable adjustment. Sometimes reasonable adjustments challenge our typical ways of working, our typical ways of thinking. That's fine. Consider it and pop it in place and keep the consistency going. And do you know what, this day-to-day accommodation, somebody said, you know what, I've worked really hard on this. Think about our ADHD person. Yeah, I worked really hard on this. Look, can I just need some downtime? We'll just not focus on this for a while and focus on this. Yeah, it's just an accommodation in the moment. If you have an autistic person that says, actually, do you know what, next couple of meetings, I'd rather not stand up and do a presentation. Can, you know, I think for now it's putting too much pressure on me. Perhaps socially, can I just take some time out from doing that? And then when I'm feeling a bit more kind of comfortable and confident, a bit more secure, then I'll go back to doing that. That's just a responsive in the moment. Yeah, I completely understand. The reasonable adjustments part, though, is where the Equality Act comes in. So I just wanted to separate those out, that just because you make 4 changes and they're a reasonable adjustment doesn't mean you can't make some improvements for all, and it doesn't mean you might have some on-the-spot requests for just general accommodations that helps that person in that moment. It's so hard to give a complete list of reasonable adjustments, right? So bear with me as I go through this. Here are just some with a headline statement. Again, I could do with flashing lights on this. Ensure you have awareness of individual needs. Do not prescribe. Do not assume. You know somebody's autistic, you know somebody has ADHD, you know somebody's dyslexic, dyscalculic, etc. There are reasons they get that diagnosis. So there will be certain things that help, but don't make an assumption of everything. Still talk to that individual about what works for them best. Do you know, and it might be they say, look, we wanted a protected, quiet area that is quiet, and that can be visually quiet, sensory quiet, calm, not doors banging and noise going, to just settle down that sensory system for a while. Be able to access room bookings, have a little bit priority maybe. You might be asked to change the layout, lighting, spacing, you know, flexible start and end times, guarantee a desk or a seat if you're hot desking. You know, if they want extended periods of concentration, find space to do that or go home. Regular and brief comfort or movement breaking. 6-hour meetings will break most people, okay? You might have a neurodivergent person saying, please no meetings longer than an hour, or can we have a 10-minute break every hour? Assistive technology, such as the wonderful talk type, things like that, that can make a real difference. Assistive technology doesn't cure anything, but goodness me, makes a real difference in terms of accessibility and people being able to show what's going on in their head, get people work to their potential. Make changes to recruitment and selection. That's a whole day's training in itself. Slides, study materials, meeting notes in advance. Flex on time and locations of meetings. Somebody said, you know what, it's really stressful getting in for 8:30 on a Monday morning. I find the travel really overwhelming, but I can get in for 10. Can our meeting start at 10:30 on Mondays? It's fine. Flexibility around deadlines. Understand what is a true deadline. Ensure you give people enough time. Those sensory aids, the ear defenders, you know, kind of screen glare protectors, something to fiddle with. Somebody sitting there with ear defenders on, chewing like a comforting chewy toy they are, and fiddling with something. That's fine. That's just their sensory needs kind of coming out. And that kind of should be allowable in the workplace. You know, and anything you promote or push out to people, make sure it's accessible, visually accessible, and also suitable for assistive technology. And extra time for those timed assessments and mandatory training, role adjustments, 1,001 more. I hate to say Google it or whatever search engine you prefer. There's a lot out there, and you can share your expertise on this as well. So I want to say thank you for listening at this point. My contact details are on. I am on social media, but social media and I tend to argue and disagree quite a lot. So it's always best to find me. I do float around on Facebook as Helen Eaton, Autism and Neurodiversity. So thank you for attending, thank you for listening, and thank you for showing your interest, a whistle-stop tour, high level on some of that stuff. But hopefully you're starting to think about what you can do different and why you should do it. And my final request before I hand over to Rich is to say, what adjustments do you make, have made, could make in the future? Pop those in chat, because that's a great way of recording that. So thank you so much for your time and for listening today. And Rich, if I go back to you.
Thanks so much, Helen. That was fantastic. I'm sure everyone will agree. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure they are, because the chat's been pretty non-stop. So yeah, thanks so much. And there's a few questions coming in, so we'll try and answer them. We don't always get through every question, but we'll try and answer them afterwards if we don't get to it. If you can use the Q&A section, it's really helpful just to kind of organise questions. So I'll start firing away if that's okay. So Helen, Lucy asks, you mentioned some employers may accept a working diagnosis, but some may stipulate they need a formal diagnosis. How does that play out legally? Oh, Helen, you're muted.
I am. I should know this by now, shouldn't I? I've done this before. It's not my first rodeo. Yes, it's complicated is what I wanted to say. There are cases where an employer, well, the tribunal found the employer should have recognised the person's distress, taken it seriously, and had conversations around support. And that person went on to discover they were autistic. Generally, if you have a diagnosis, that there's absolute clarity there. Some employers do accept working diagnosis, and actually in a tribunal, if you have done your best and you've worked with a working diagnosis and recognise that somebody is really struggling or is seeking to get a diagnosis, I think that puts you in a really strong position. But it is very much an employer's choice. But you should do the best by your employee. So it's a grey and developing area. I would always err on the side of caution. You don't suddenly acquire ADHD, you don't suddenly acquire dyslexia. That person really needs to have had these traits, these differences throughout their life. And if those are there and they're demonstrating them day in, day out at work, I would kind of respect that as a working diagnosis. Perfect. Thank you very much, Helen. That's really helpful. Another question here, which is regarding reasonable adjustments. Isn't a reasonable adjustment subjective to the employer or the organisation's interpretation? And how can you, what would you advise if what's been offered isn't sufficient? So, yeah. Okay, so if we think about why we put a reasonable adjustment in place, so this thing that I need to do is expected part of my job role. That's what I'm contracted to do. But without an adjustment, without some sort of assistive tech or perhaps some changes to the way things are happening or some accessibility needs, I can't do that. Well, then it becomes reasonable to put that in place, I think. Reasonable, it's not quantifiable. Yes, it may be subjective, but if an employer puts some reasonable adjustments in place, they don't meet that individual's needs, then they're not appropriate. So it's about looking at the individual and putting needs in place that are suitable, that remove barriers and allow them to access what everyone else is accessing ultimately. Because if you're arguing over what's reasonable and that person isn't able to do their job or do their best, then that employer is not being fair to them, I think. So, under law, have to think about that. Absolutely. Catherine's got an interesting question here, which is the law different or the same for universities compared to the workplace? I don't know if you know the difference there. It's the same. I think there's sometimes different language when you kind of look at the government websites around this, look at the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments. There can be different examples for universities, but the reasonable adjustment actually applies in education, in public spaces, in the workplace. But what you do might be different.
Right. That's yeah, really helpful. And yeah, lots of people saying thanks, and quite a lot in the chat as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to scour through the chat and kind of gather questions together to answer, and we'll try and do that sort of asynchronously, because we often don't manage to get through all of them at the end of these sessions. And I know there was a lot of questions coming in through the chat. So what we will do is we'll wrap up there and make sure people can get off on time. So yeah, all I want to say is a massive thank you first of all to Helen. Thank you for coming along and sharing all that information that you've shared. That it's been incredibly helpful, and as you can see from the chat, that it's been very well received. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for participating. Month on month, our kind of community's growing, and it's fantastic to see. And what's particularly brilliant is people sharing their own experiences and views in the chat. And yeah, it's really nice that we've managed to kind of foster that community in a space in order to do that. So thank you everybody for coming along and taking the time to learn about something and discuss something different, and hopefully something that benefits lots more people than just in our group and our community. So you will be getting a CPD certificate. So after this webinar, you'll be sent a survey. Survey link, if you can fill that out, and we'll ask if you want a CPD certificate, and we'll send one over. So if you do, then look out for that link. As we've mentioned and has been asked a few times, and we have kind of recorded this, so you'll be getting an email with today's recording, the transcript, as well as slides as well. So all of that will be provided to you, and it will also be up on socials as well in the next day or so. As I mentioned, we run one of these webinars every month, and our next one is the 9th of May, which is a Thursday. So if you would like to come along to that, Danielle Kujo Makowski is talking about navigating neurodiversity and talking about her journey in the corporate world, which is going to be fantastic. So again, eyes peeled in your inbox for information regarding that, and also it will be on socials. So I think that is it for today. Thank you everybody for joining us, and yeah, for participating. And yeah, we'll let you get back to your afternoon wherever you are. Thanks so much.